very kind. Well, let me launch into the topic what's happened to it? Oh, I think it's difficult. That's exciting. So if we move on, what I want to do is rethink a little bit about how we might reshape the educational process. And what I want to look at largely at the moment is teaching, how we could rethink the ways we teach things. And a part of that turns on how we conceive of children. Now, most people, conceive of children is not way to put this. I mean, how we think about children and their development. We all see children through our theories. We don't see the world or children as they are. We see them mediated by the theories we hold and the ideas we have. And we behave the way we do because of the ideas we have. And now, some people think that they see children as they really are, and that they don't have theories about it. They just see, and they're the dangerous people. The people who, in education, there are two kinds of people: those who are aware of the theories they have, and those who are not aware of them. And the ones who are not aware of the theories they hold think they see the truth. And one has to be very wary of such people, because they can't be persuaded because they don't know that they're using theories to make sense of the world they're a part of. And I want to look very quickly at a series of the dominant theories that we've held and have mixed up together. And these mirror somewhat the ideas that I talked about earlier this morning when I mentioned the different kinds of theories of education, which surprisingly mirror fairly well the theories that we've held about children and their development. So the first idea is one from cultures long ago and from people today. We somehow see children as gradually fitting into the society around them. And that's the most simple idea we have. Of course, how we see that happening tends to be a little different for each of us. The second idea, again, very largely shaped by Plato, is this notion that somehow the accumulation of certain privileged kinds of knowledge will carry the mind to increasing clarity and clarity of understanding about the world. So it's a process that we still have this sense that it's important to learn certain kinds of things because you get a better, fuller, richer understanding. And in Plato's terms, this also involves the development of courage and a whole series of other things. That it's not a crude matter of simply adding fact after fact after fact. The third idea is this one I mentioned from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the notion that somehow what we see happening in children is the passage through regular stages of development. That idea has become very popular. The fourth idea there is one from Lev Vygotsky, which you're likely somewhat familiar with. Vygotsky had the notion that what happens is that as we live in a society, we pick up certain tools. And the tools that we develop shape for us the kind of understanding that we can have of the world around us. And that in some sense we are products of the toolkits that we develop. I must admit, of those ideas, I find that the most attractive in some ways, because it incorporates some of the others, but has, I think, an enriched sense of the fact that our consciousness is shaped by the kinds of cultures that we are a part of. So let me talk about cognitive tools for a little moment or two, and ask first of all what they are. Now, to get a sense of what cognitive tools are, you have to imagine that it's 75,000 years ago, and it's midday, and you're on the plains of Africa, and it's very hot, and nearby you see a very large thorn tree, and against the thorn tree has been built a lean-to, a sort of shack with very rough coverings with branches of trees and animal skins to create shade for as much of the tribe as can fit in. Are you there? Are you with me? You're in the plains of Africa. You can feel the heat. You can see the lean-to, and the tribe is there, gathered around in the shade created by the covering. Now you can walk into this, and you see people at the front making tools or playing around with things and chatting quietly. But then as you go into the deeper shade at the back of the lean-to, you realize in the far distance, right at the back, in the coolest part of the tent affair, leaning or lying on the softest animal's furs and snoring gently is a rather fat man who is clearly held in high regard by the tribe. And you discover that he's held in high regard because about a dozen years ago he invented the past tense. Somebody did. Anyway, as you chat and get to know this, you discover that he actually has twin daughters. And it was the twin daughters who invented the past tense, and he took the idea and flogged it and has taken the credit. But your tribe is held in high regard by all the other tribes, because everybody's picking this past tense up and using it, because it adds to our ability to articulate our experience and indeed to understand our experience a little bit better. Anyway, the daughters are now in their 20s and more aware of intellectual property rights, and they're planning in a couple of weeks' time a launch of the subjunctive. Within IPO, you can buy into the subjunctive if you want. Now, again, somebody invented the past tense, somebody invented the subjunctive. These things that just happen. They created for their users tools that enrich and enlarge our ability to articulate our experience and to explain it to others. And what has happened in the last 75,000 years is a whole range of these cognitive tools that have been invented by others that are now available to us to pick up as we learn to master a language and fit into a society. We can pick up all kinds of tools like maps and computer systems and all kinds of tools that can enlarge for us our ability to make sense of our world and to enlarge our ability to articulate our experience better. This is when you have to do it 4 times. So these cognitive tools, the kind of work I've been doing, and the research group I work with, which is called the Imaginative Education Research Group, you have to call it something. It's not the best, but that's what we're stuck with now. What I've been trying to show is ways in which you can see these sets of cognitive tools adding up to distinctive kinds of understanding. So what I want to do is explore rather quickly at least 3 of these different kinds of understanding that you get when you grow up into a society and pick up a toolkit. And I want to talk about these kinds of toolkits and how they're constructed and what the implications are then for teaching, particularly in the schools and institutions. So I'll talk about the somatic understanding, that's the kind of understanding you get with the body, mythic understanding, which comes with oral language, romantic understanding, which comes with written language, and then philosophic understanding comes with the theoretic, abstract kinds of language, and ironic understanding is this reflexiveness that gives you the ability to understand and appreciate Monty Python. So the first toolkit, I'll just look at a few of the things that come along. When you get a human body, and I'm glad to see you all brought your bodies with you this evening, when you get one of these things, you get a toolkit for sense making. And I just want to look at some of the tools that are central to having a human body and being able to use those tools to make sense of the world. And they're what Ted Hughes, the poet, calls little factories of understanding. So, thank you. So if we look at bodily senses, we tend to think of ourselves as having minds and bodies, which is very strange. I mean, I'm sure cats and dogs don't think of themselves as having minds and bodies, but we've got into this peculiar habit. What happens to us first is that our minds somehow spread into our senses. And you can see that happening with the babies, young babies, and you can play games with them. Babies are great things to play games with. You just start up, after once they're a month old, you can start doing and you pat them on the belly. And what is happening is that they're coordinating sight, sound, and touch. And they do, the first time you do it, they look at you as though you're slightly deranged. And then the third time, they realize this is a joke. And they start giggling. And then after a while, you go and then they laugh. And what you set up is a kind of incongruity. You created a pattern. The pattern takes on a meaning by itself. You create incongruities in the pattern, and it leads to humor. And we'll talk about that in a minute. these senses remain for us throughout our lives the clearest ways in which we can make sense of our world around us. So that we always want, I mean, if you look at Einstein talking about relativity, when he talks about riding on a light wave and what the cosmos looks like from riding on a light wave when you're approaching the speed of light, you can follow sort of what he means, but then he gets off the light wave and starts writing formula and you think, so we need, as much as we can, these sensory attachments to things that we want to make sense of. The late unlamented education minister in Afghanistan, the Taliban minister, one time was meeting with a bunch of Western journalists, and he said, "You people are ridiculous." He said, "You believe that the sun is 93 million miles away from the Earth." And he said, "Look, whoever has built a tape measure that long? How could you know?" And you can have some sympathy because he wanted something sensory that he could feel to measure these distances. And indeed, if we believe it's 93 million miles away, we need to be aware that it's an act of faith for us as well. Another thing, another tool that you get with the human body is a bunch of emotions. And these emotions remain for us throughout our lives as the main orienters we have to knowledge. We are what David Kresh calls per-thinkers. We perceive and we feel and we think together always. Nobody ever simply thinks. Our feelings are attached to these in all kinds of ways. These emotions then are our most powerful, most fundamental orienters to knowledge. And somehow they don't seem to play a very large role in many classrooms. And yet at the same time they're the most powerful tools we have for orienting. So, thank you. Another thing with human beings, every baby, about a week and a half, begins to smile. Every baby, everywhere. If you play peekaboo games, you know, you can see how you set up these little games and babies will smile at you in this charming, helpless way. And of course our modes of engaging in this activity change as we get older, so I don't advise playing the peekaboo with a 45-year-old on the bus opposite of you. Things change a little bit as you go on. And again, this humour is crucially important for human beings to set us into networks of association and performs many important activities for us. And we would be, again, silly to forget that the students in front of us are humorous animals. That humour is crucial not just to their everyday entertainment, but rather to their sense-making in the world that we're a part of. Another feature, when you get a human body, you also get, as a part of the toolkit, you get a sense of rhythm. If I go, thank you. No other animal does that. Many animals use patterns, but no other animal tracks patterns the way human beings do. That is, the sounds we create, again, we set up arbitrary, totally arbitrary patterns, and then we begin to fill them with meaning by the ways in which we share expectations about them. So that Beethoven's symphonies create immensely powerful emotional responses purely on the basis of the ways in which arbitrary sound can be delivered into meaningful patterns by human beings in very peculiar ways. I don't know if anyone read Stephen Mithen's book. I recommend, if you haven't read it, The Singing Neanderthals. It was a bestseller about 3 years ago, I guess. But it's about how we are the singing Neanderthals. We are a musical animal. And pattern is crucial to our sense-making in all kinds of ways, not just mathematics, but in all kinds of areas. So we need, again, to be attentive to the fact that the children we have in our classes are patterning, rhythmic, musical animals. If you sit the 9-month-old baby on the floor by the fire next to the cat and point at the door, typically the baby will look at the door and the cat will look at your finger. So there's something about, again, the ways in which we set up patterns of expectation by the forms of gesture that we use that, again, is quite unique. And again, if we want to attend to something about the nature of the children we're teaching, we have to recognize the ways in which gesture plays a very peculiar, intentional role for human beings. Okay, so those are just a few of the tools that you get with the human body. And so if you think of the body as a toolkit for sense-making, those are just a few of the crucial things. You know, we're a musical animal, we're a humorous animal, We have a bunch of senses, and we use intentionality in peculiar ways, and primarily we have these immensely important emotions. And what I want to do now is explore something of what happens to those tools when we start the next stage of our language adventure, which is to pick up an oral language. So what I'll do is explore some of the tools that you get with an oral language, and I'll just look at stories and binary opposites, images, and a few other bits and pieces. So we'll take them one at a time. So when you pick up an oral language between ages about 1.5, 2 to about 4, 5, or 6, you become fluent in an oral language. You can't fail to become fluent in an oral language. You don't have to worry about people not learning an oral language because they can't fail to learn if they're in a language using environment. One of the great tools that comes along with an oral language is the story. If earthworms and emus talked, they would tell each other stories, because the story is one of the most fundamental uses of an oral language. And it does a lot of peculiar things. There's definitions of a story, a narrative that fixes our affective orientation to the elements that make it up, the kind of definition that needs a definition, I sometimes think. If we give an example of he shot Tom, if I say to you, he shot Tom, nobody's burst into tears that I can see, and none of you is cheering. But we'd elaborate a bit and say that he always wore a nice jacket and tie and loved his grandmother, and Tom picked his nose in public and used foul language in front of children. You begin to feel glad that he shot Tom, right? Clearly Tom had it coming. But we could elaborate a bit further and we say he loved his grandmother. We should have said he loved his grandmother. They had an unspeakable relationship. And he and the grandmother were busy selling drugs to kids outside schools. And Tom, despite his unprepossessing exterior, was actually an undercover cop trying to stop him and the grandmother selling the drugs to the kids. Now you begin to feel sorry that he shot Tom. You know you've reached the end of the story when you know how to feel about the events that make it up. That's how we know we've reached the end of stories. You can't program a computer to recognize a story and when it's reached the end of the story because it doesn't have any feelings. Stories are unique in human experience because they are the only linguistic form we have that can fix for us how to feel about events. You've probably noticed that the problems with life and history are just one damn thing after another. And we can give meaning to them only to the degree that we can fit them into stories. We invent stories for ourselves to give meaning. Okay? So the bad news of this late afternoon or the evening is that your lines have no meaning. I'm sorry. But we create meaning for ourselves by creating provisional stories that we fit our lives into. You fit the events that you're currently experiencing, my sympathy, into a story about why you're here, what's going on. But if you're bored out of your mind in a few minutes, you make a run for the door, and then just as you get to the door, you trip and really wrench your ankle really badly, really strain it, really painfully, which is the only proper punishment for trying to get out of it. But you have to be taken off to the hospital, and you're saying to yourself in the ambulance, oh, damn, if I hadn't come to that stupid lecture. Oh, God, it really hurts. And then they bind up your leg, and a few days later you can go out on crutches, and you're a bit bored, so you go to a local store and you can buy yourself a lottery ticket and you win $20 million. Now you're glad you came. Oh, sorry you came to the lecture, because if you hadn't come to the lecture, you would have sprained your ankle, you would now have $20 million. But of course, what you do with the $20 million is buy yourself a Lamborghini and go out onto the highway, and the first time out, you're crunched by a big truck. You're dead. Now you're glad, sorry, that you came to the lecture. So the problem with life is that you can never know how to feel about the events that you're going through. The friends you think are closest and most treasured, you discover who betrayed you mercilessly. It's a horrible life. I don't know how to go on. The Greeks had a nice saying, that is, call no one happy until they're dead. Because it's only when you're dead, it's only at the end that you can know how to make sense of the things that are a part of the life that you have led. It's only at the end of history that you can make sense of history. So we have provisional sense-making. But the only tool that we have, this is only to underline the fact that the only tool we have to fix emotional meaning is the story. Which is why, of course, our newspapers are full of stories, stories because we crave security and meaning. In a life that is riddled with ambiguity and just casual events, this need for security of knowing how to feel about events is immensely powerful for us. Now, wouldn't we be silly if we ignored that when teaching children? Anyway, which of course we do most of the time. So we just moved on to the next one. Did we miss the last one? No, this is where we should be now. Sorry. Oh, you're just ahead of me. Sorry. Now, if you look at the kinds of stories that young children tend to enjoy most, things like the grim fairy tales, for example. The average 4-year-old enjoys Cinderella, Jack and the Beanstalk, Hansel and Gretel, etc. You can notice a few things about these stories. The first is they're articulated on binary opposites. That's fancy language for the fact that if you look just under the surface of the story, you can see their struggles between security and fear, courage and cowardice, ultimately good and bad. And you can notice two things about these binary opposites. The first is that they're immensely abstract. That is, every 4-year-old is using the most abstract ideas human beings ever learn, all the time, constantly, and making sense of their world around them. As you probably are aware, education has developed this bizarre common view that young children are concrete learners. Now, this is a theory clearly articulated by somebody who's never actually spoken to a human child, because if you actually did something as radical as talk to a child, you would see that they're using abstract ideas all the time and making sense of their lives and the world around them. The second thing you can notice about these binary opposites is that they're affective, they're emotionally charged. So it makes sense to say, in better sense, if you want to make any concrete content meaningful to young children, you need to build it on these abstract binary opposites that are effectively charged, emotionally charged, because that's their access to their meaning. Thank you. I'll beat you to it that time. Now, if you look at, again, the kinds of things that interest children, a part of the bizarre folklore of education also is that when you start with children, you start with where they are, and start with the world around them, because that's where young children can understand things. So the social studies curriculum is a perfect example. You start with families and their local surroundings and things like this. But when you actually look at what children are interested in, it's things like talking middle-class rabbits, and you think, well, if their minds are somehow dominated by their everyday surroundings, well, I haven't been in Missouri long enough, I guess, but where I come from, there just aren't any talking middle-class rabbits or lowly worm or whatever it might be. These kinds of creatures that you find filling the stories that most engage children simply don't exist. They're what we call fantasy stories. So where are they coming from? Well, here's a kind of explanation that is, in what I think is, in an important way, very anti-Piagetian. Piaget's notion is, as you probably know, that percepts dominate concepts for young children. I think that may be true of some very limited circumstances, but for most of what engages children's minds, exactly the opposite seems to be the case. Let's just take an example of how this might work. If you think of how we make sense of the phenomenal world around us, the everyday, the stuff that we're dealing with when we're young children, and I'll take the example of the temperature continuum here, that you first learn the concepts of hot and cold. Hot simply means hotter than my body, and cold means colder than my body. And hard is harder than my body, and soft is softer than my body, big is bigger than my body, little is little, etc. So the body is the criterion, and you have these binary opposites formed around it. Once you have binary opposites in place, you can then mediate between them. So you can develop a concept like warm, and then you can mediate between warm and cold, and develop a concept like cool, or mediate between warm and hot, and develop a concept like pretty hot. That is, we can conceptually elaborate a whole series of terms that give us an increasing ability to understand and articulate ideas about temperature. And we use that in dealing with a whole range of things that are part of our environment, and we are very successful as a continent in making sense of the world around us. Now, the problem with the world, as you've probably noticed again, is that there are some things in it that aren't like these continuum from hot to cold and wet to dry, big to little, etc. But there are some things like life and death, which is a binary opposite. So the bad news, what do you get if you mediate between life and death? If you use that as the procedure that has been very useful in making sense of the physical world around you, when you apply it to life and death, you generate creatures like ghosts. So, I'm sorry if you believe in ghosts, but there aren't any ghosts. I'm sorry, it's just that it's an artifact of a mode that we have found very successful in making sense of our everyday physical world, applied to discrete binary opposites. So even though they're discrete, that is, there's nothing between them, we fill these categories. All human cultures distinguish between human and animal. Many cultures distinguish it in different ways from the way it's common with us, but what you get if you mediate between human and animal, well, you get, Yetis, Sasquatches, mermaids, you get all these creatures that are both human in some degree and animal in some degree. And a Yeti is to human and animal, as ghosts to the life and death, as warm is to hot and cold. They work much the same. And a very profound distinction available for all young children, even though they don't articulate it this way. I mean, if you take your young grandchildren for a walk in the woods, and as is usual, the grandchildren sit on a nice bench that has been hollowed out of a tree, and the grandparents jump around in the ferns and play throwing games and stuff. The grandchildren sitting there recognize the difference between a bench or a lawn that has been shaped for human cultural purposes, for sitting down, and one that's being left to rot. That is, the distinction between natural and cultural is very profound, even though we don't typically at age 4 articulate it in those terms. And what do you get when you mediate between nature and culture? Well, you get talking middle-class rabbits on Mr. Data in Star Trek, or Star Wars, I think, or Star Trek. Now, these are not casual things. See, what you've got in those mediating categories is the stuff of all the fantasy stories of the world, and also the stuff of all the myth stories of the world. All cultural myth stories are built on, if you believe Lady Strauss, nature, culture, human, animal, life, death. There are constant meditations on these fundamental distinctions that are evident in our lives, but don't fit the normal categories of the continua from hot to cold, big to little, that have been so successful, whereas in making sense of our world. So let me mention a few other of these tools. Another tool that comes along with an oral language is the ability, the peculiar ability to form images from words. If I tell you the story of a teacher who's been working hard all day, it's a hot sunny day, and she's driving home, and there's the reflection of the sun on the windscreens of cars coming towards her, and she's getting an increasing headache as she gets home. But she gets home, and at the back of her garden, she's got a Japanese garden, and she goes out there with a cup of tea and sits on one of the grey stones around the pond and notices that 3 new red water lilies have opened up that day, and by the side of the pond there is a yellow tea house, and to the other side of the pond there is a green moss garden with grey stones nicely placed, and there's a gravel area as well nearby. Now, this is very strange. What's happened is I have sucked air into my lungs and then let it out slowly over my larynx and pharynx and shaped it with my tongue. And these are just some of the sounds human beings can make. And somehow this has generated images in your mind. Now, all the images will be different, but at the same time, you can't not form some image unless you're asleep, and my sympathy, and I'm grateful that you're not snoring loudly. But somehow this is a very peculiar activity that human beings engage in. And yet it's a part of the toolkit you get when you develop an oral language. And these are, if I ask you to think for a minute about the most disturbing or powerful events of your life, what you will do initially is call up an image that will be emotionally charged. These images have immense power in communicating emotional meaning along with the content that you want to get across. And how much do we use these in classrooms? Yeah. Not much. If you open an educational textbook, you'll see a great deal about content and concepts and communicating these. You'll see very rarely anything about how to discover within the content powerful emotional images that can carry that content into the child's mind. Thank you. So another part of the toolkit that comes along with an oral language is the joke. And the joke is an extension, obviously, of the kind of humour that you see at work with babies. If I ask you, when is a door not a door, you say? Thank you. Yes. Now, what the hell's going on there? I mean, why do 6-year-olds enjoy that kind of joke a lot? Well, I mean, one thing, to suggest an answer, one thing those kinds of jokes do is they help to make language visible. That you begin to see language as an object, not merely as a behavior. And that ability to reflect upon language is crucial for the development of what, I guess in textbooks they call meta-linguistic awareness. That is, it's crucial for the development of flexible uses of language. The ability to see language as an object that you can manipulate and play with is crucial. And the best tool we have available for doing that is the joke. So I would make, part of my curriculum would involve at least 3.5 hours every week which children told each other jokes. And they learned how to tell jokes, and they practiced jokes, and they all became jokesters. Because, and I'm willing to take a bet with anybody that if you did that for a year in any class, the reading scores would go right through the roof. Far better than the kind of... the hat will go out. The kinds of literacy studies that we do at the moment seem to ignore the fact that the great tool we have is, one of the great tools we have for developing our language use and understanding is the joke. Thank you. Now you may know there's a famous exchange of letters between Isaac Newton and his nephew when Isaac Newton was a very old man. And the nephew wrote to him and said, "Gosh, you must be the smartest guy around. You know, you've invented, theories, laws of motion, optics. You invented calculus. And you must know more than anybody knows." And it's probably true. The incomparable Mr. Newton, as John Locke called him. But Newton wrote back to the nephew and said, "Well, it may seem so to you, but to myself I feel like a boy on the seashore, captivated by a prettier shell or a smoother stone, when all the great ocean of knowledge has been there and I haven't even noticed it." And what he represents is, one sense of humility, but at the same time a sense of mystery, that what we know about the world and our lives is pitifully little. But how do we represent the world to children? Well, we bring them into schools, and the first grade there's a math textbook and a science textbook, and grade 2 there's another one, grade 3. We represent them, and by the time they get to grade 12 they're this thick, and in college they're this thick. We represent the world as known and rather dull. Whereas in fact it's the exploration, what we have, and indeed we should be proud of what we have brought into what I guess W.H. Auden calls the bright circle of our recognition. But we have to recognize that what we have brought into that circle of our recognition is pitifully little. And around it is a great sense of mystery. We have no clue what the hell's going on. We tell ourselves stories to try and defend ourselves against the difficulties that we have in facing up to our condition of ignorance. But we don't give children any sense of that in schools. We don't give them a sense of what an amazing adventure it is bringing things into the bright circle of our recognition. Thank you. So, one of the things we've been doing at the Imaginative Education Research Group is trying to work out ways that we can take some of these kinds of observations about the cognitive tools that children have available when they have an oral language, and seeing how we can design planning tools, planning frameworks for them to use in planning their teaching. You probably are aware, I'm sure it's true here as in many places, most students are taught that they must begin their planning by stating their objectives as clearly as possible, and then they must get the content that they need organized, and then they must design the methods that they're going to use, and then they have to have the evaluation procedure to make sure that the objectives they had at the beginning have been achieved. And that is almost universally taught to teachers as how to plan a lesson. Now, I don't know how many of you are aware, probably many of you, that that method is derived from the success of American factories in building refrigerators and motor cars in the 1920s. That is, what happened if you were designing a refrigerator. What you do first is you design the refrigerator in great detail, and then you find all the materials that you need to build the refrigerator, and then you arrange on the assembly line the skills and methods that will bring those pieces together. And then in industry at the end you have what is called a quality control, and that just to make sure it works. Now that model of designing refrigerators and building them was taken over and made the model that is used by teachers universally for planning and teaching lessons. Now it's never seemed to me obvious that the ideal model for teaching children about the wonders of the world around them is how to build refrigerators. And yet somehow that's what we've done. We've built that into the system of education we've got. And what we're offering here is an alternative way of thinking the world as full of great stories that we want to tell children. So instead of thinking about the world as a sense of objectives we need to attain, we want to think about it as a sense of great stories that we want to tell children. And not stories in the sense necessarily of fictions, but rather the way the editor says to the journalist, what's the story on the fire downtown? The editor isn't asking the journalist to go out and invent a fiction about the fire. What they're asking him to do is work out what is the important facts about the fire, and how do you organize those in a way that will be gripping to the imaginations of our readers. The same as on the television. When you get a news story, they say, what's the story on this? We talk about them as news stories. Again, we're not looking for fictions. We're looking for attractive and powerful ways of communicating the meaning of the content. And that's what we want to do with children in classrooms. So this is just one model. We've got a number, and I'll leave with Steve actually, we have some what we call circular frameworks that have been recently developed by one of the teachers who works with us, that a lot of the teachers find much more accessible ways of organizing this rather linear system that I developed 13,000 years ago. Let me give you a quick 30 example. I won't spend too long, we don't have too long, but we'll talk about teaching place value, decimal system to children about age 6. And how would you do that using the story structure? Well, here's a simple way. You could talk about a king who wants to count his army. I apologize, I realize that's in the book that many of you might have been compelled to read, but I'm sure it becomes new. So the king sees the army milling around on the plain below him, and he says, I want to know how many soldiers I've got, And he's got 5, to cut it short, rather clueless councillors and 1 clever councillor. And eventually the clever councillor says to the king, well, get each of the clueless councillors to pick up 10 stones each, 10 little pebbles. And then what you need is a table, and put in front of each of the councillors a bowl. And what the councillor at the end does, as the soldiers go past back to their barracks or off to war, whatever the soldiers do, is for each soldier who goes by, he puts 1 stone in a bowl. So it's a really exciting afternoon. And when the 10 stones are down, he picks them up again. So he's just doing this through the afternoon as the soldiers go by. Now the soldier to his left, the councillor to his left, who, for gender equity purposes, she simply has to watch him. And each time he picks the 10 stones up, she puts 1 down. So she has a slightly dull about her. And she's doing this every now and then. When her 10 pebbles are down, she picks them up again. So she's just keeping up. And the clueless councillor to her left simply has to watch her, and each time she picks her 10 up, he puts 1 down. So over the afternoon, we've got 1, 3, 0, 7, 8 stones in the bowl. So we know we've got 13,078 soldiers in the army. And everybody's happy. Now, you can tell a story like this with the children and take a little bit longer than the 38 seconds I've taken. And then you can get the children to count each other, count other things, change the base from 10. And 2 things tend to happen. One is they learn the algorithm much more easily and quickly because it's in a meaningful context. The second thing that's probably more important is that they make an emotional association with the cleverness of the counsellor, the clever counsellor. They actually make the association with the cleverness of mathematics because they recognize they're mathematical animals. But they, consciously, it's through the association is with the clever counsellor. Sorry. Now, what I want to do is move on. So you've got a body that has a toolkit that comes with it, and we've looked at some of those tools. Then you develop an oral language, and the oral language comes with another toolkit, which we just looked at some of the features, the stories, the images, the jokes, etc. And now when you develop a literacy, you get a whole new toolkit that comes along with literacy. And what I want to do is just look at a few of these tools. If you tell a 4-year-old the story of Cinderella, typically the 4-year-old doesn't say to you, what means of locomotion does the fairy godmother use? Or what's the physics of changing pumpkins into coaches? But if you tell the equally fantastic story of Superman to the 10-year-old, you have to explain that Superman was born on the planet Krypton, and his dad and Marlon Brando shot off into space, and he landed wherever it was, and the molecular structure of our sun is such that when he gets down to his pajamas, he's got these superpowers. And I don't know if you know Peter Rabbit's story. I don't know. When you're 4, you don't worry about the fact that Peter Rabbit is drinking a cup of chamomile tea with a paw. I don't know if you've ever tried that, but it's not easy. But if you read Watership Down, Watership Down is a book about rabbits for teenagers, and Hazel and Bigwig make quite different accommodations with reality to those that are made by Peter Rabbit. So something is happening with the onset of literacy. I don't think this is a developmental thing. This is a product of learning a new toolkit, and the toolkit of literacy has, the way we teach it has certain kinds of intellectual effects. It's not routine, it's not automatic, but the ways in which literacy is encouraged has certain kinds of cognitive effects. So let's move on, because I'm conscious that I'm talking too much and people want to have dinner. Now again, part of the slightly bizarre folklore education is that if you want to start a new topic with students, you should begin with what they already know. Now this is a wonderful principle to follow if you want to bore children out of their minds. Because in fact, most of what they everyday run around is what they're trying to escape from. If you look at what they're really interested in, it's things like, who are the longest fingernails ever? Who is the hairiest person who ever lived? It's the exotic, the strange, and the bizarre of reality that they want first to know about. And this is a very sensible procedure. If I was very generous and my visa bill could handle it, I would take you all now to a North Italian town and invite you to, set up in the hotel and then start exploring the town. You'd be a bit silly if you then got out a magnifying glass and started looking at the carpet of the hotel room and then the wallpaper and watch your way down the corridor and gradually out into the streets. But we have built that principle into our curriculum. We call it expanding horizons notion, that somehow you start with where you are and gradually move outwards. What you would more sensibly do is sort of wander out and find out where the walls are and the cathedral and the main square. And what you would look at would not be the things that are familiar to you, but you would look at and be engaged by the things that are most different from your everyday experience. And that's very much how the young teenagers begin to explore their world. That is, children from about 8 to 12, 15. So their initial beginnings, their initial discovery of reality is not with the immediate features of their everyday world, but rather with the things that are strange and exotic, because that gives them the context within which their everyday reality has meaning. Because without the context, we have no clue. Thank you. Now again, I hope you've left the plains of Africa. What I'd like you to do now is revert back to age 11. Try to remember what it was like when you were 11 years old. Are you there? When you're 11, your ego is developing, your sense of independence, being is developing, your will and your desire to do things is developing, but at the same time, you have to wear what your mother tells you. You have to obey bus timetable schedules. You have to obey the rules in school. You've got that is, you're developing a sense of independence, but at the same time you're constantly held in by other people's rules in a world I never made, as it were. So what do? Well, like every other 11-year-old pretty well in the galaxy, what you do is you make an association with those people or those things that seem best able to overcome the threats that hem you in. You got that one? We associate with those things that are best able to overcome the things that hold us in. So the young girl might associate with Britney Spears because Britney clearly doesn't have to wear what her mother tells her, we hope. And she has the money, the power that the young girl likes, in the same way that, I don't know, a sports star has the strength, the skill, and the money that the boy likes. So we all make these associations, the function they perform for us is to give us some kind of security in a very threatening world. And if you want to pause, you can go back to your present condition now, and pause and think who your heroes are. You think about who your heroes are. It will tell you something about what you remain insecure about. Okay? So that's the function that we have. We associate with those things that transcend the threats that we feel hemmed in by. So everything that we teach a child in the curriculum has some features in it that allow us to connect with some kind of transcendent quality, some heroic quality that is a part of everything we teach. Thank you. Nearly every 7-year-old starts a hobby or a collection, reaches a peak about age 11, dies out about 15. Nearly everywhere. What the hell is going on? There's something strange about this. I mean, apart from the phenomenon itself, what you can see in the collections and hobbies of these early teenagers is the greatest expenditure, usually, of intellectual energy among that age group of children. And sometimes it reaches a ferocious peak, as you probably know. And I'm sure you can remember the things that you collected or the hobbies that you had, and maybe you still have the attic, still has your collection of spoons or whatever it might be. If you open an educational textbook, you will see no mention of this phenomenon. That is, the phenomenon in which you see one of the greatest expenditures of intellectual energy of students is absolutely ignored by the educational world as though it doesn't exist. We're in a crazy business, talking about the theories that dominate what we see in the world. What the hell's going on? Well, I mean, one way to explain it is simply to say that when you're 11 and discovering about reality, one of the problems is that reality may be infinite. If reality is infinite, you're infinitely insignificant. This is not easy to put up with. So what we all do is search for something that we can exhaustively discover about that will give us some security in a world that may be infinitely complex. And the hobby, the collection, gives us that kind of fundamental security that is immensely important to us. So that every child in a classroom across the galaxy at these ages desires that kind of, they need some knowledge that they can just explore exhaustively. Everything we teach in the curriculum has some features of it that can be exhaustively discovered by children. Incidentally, the only study I was able to find about children's collections was by a woman called Carolyn Freer Burke, and the study was done in 1907 in California. I mean, there have been little things since, but very little that's had any attempt to explain what the hell is going on with this most obvious phenomena that would be, we think, absolutely crucial to anybody in education. So, I just remembered a phrase of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's who says that reading is the curse of childhood. I sometimes think the book is the curse of education in some sense, that what we've tended to do is think that we want to make children's minds a bit more like books. Because you know what you do with a book, you write something in it, and then you come back 6 months later and there it is, just the way you put it. Wouldn't it be nice if you tell the student something and you come back 6 months later, there it is, the way you taught them. You taught them how to prove that opposite interior angles are congruent. 6 months later, there they know it. But as you know very well, you come back 6 months later, they say opposite one. And you know those awful studies of children leaving school and entering college and what they know about the world around them. The curriculum is this massive, huge encyclopedia of human knowledge, and it is evaporated from their minds like snow on a spring morning or something, looking for appropriate metaphors. But it disappears and doesn't hold much in place. What we need to do with children is to, in this case early teenagers, is to try to show them that the knowledge that we are to teach them is a product of the experience and the intentions of the emotions of somebody. In fact, Steve, if you want to go on about 3 stops, 1, 2, 3, there. And I was amused that you used this quote earlier. So this is, so the principle is that all knowledge is human knowledge. Okay, all knowledge grows out of human hopes, fears, and passions. And if we want to engage students in learning about the world around them, we have to show it to them in the context of the hopes and the fears and the passions in which it was invented in the first place, from which it finds living meaning. Because if we don't do that, we simply bore children out of their minds, which is what happens most of the time. So that whenever we communicate any factual information that has lost its hold on the passions and the hopes and the fears of somebody at some time, their intentions, then we lose its power to give them additional life, and it just becomes something to a leaden weight, which they will forget very quickly. So if we go back a few minutes. Sorry. So, thank you. Forward. Thank you. So again, what we've been doing is taking that set of cognitive tools or learning tools and trying to invent an alternative planning method that again asks about identifying these kinds of transcendent qualities, heroic qualities, and organizing them into a narrative rather than beginning with our objectives, content, etc. So let me just give you an example. We'll take some of the cognitive tools we just looked at, and I'll just do one of these, the example of teaching about eels, which I just took these randomly from the British Columbia curriculum. You have to teach 14-year-olds about eels in British Columbia or some kind of invertebrate sea creature. The eels used to be a great delicacy, loved by the ancient Romans, Greeks, and Egyptians. They all loved to eat eels. The small problem they had with eels was that nobody had ever seen a pregnant one. So there's a tiny problem about where the hell they were coming from. Aristotle had this notion that when horses drink from a river, the hair from their mane falls out and it gets into the mud at the bottom of the river, and then out of that, elvers, baby eels, are born. As Chomsky said, bad theory is better than no theory at all. But that one didn't go very far. And Linnaeus, the great biologist, thought he'd found a pregnant eel. It turned out to be parasitic worms, but he was not persuaded. And then only in the late 19th century, did people, some guys in the Mediterranean, late 19th century, classifying, organizing all kinds of knowledge, were pulling some larvae out of the Mediterranean, put them into tanks, and lo and behold, these larvae turned into elvers, baby eels. So we have the sense that, well, at least we know where they're coming from, but somehow these larvae, but nobody knew where the larvae came from. And the hero of our story is a Dane, a fellow called Johannes Schmidt, who decided he wanted to know where all the eels were coming from. And he then set about, he spent 20-odd years on rusting hulks, traveling around up to the Arctic, down to the Azores, to the Bahamas, constantly taking samples from the oceans, and he had a whole bunch of sea captains who were going to and fro, and they would take samples as well and label where they'd pick them out. And eventually, he started in the Mediterranean, actually, so the first thing he noticed was that the closer to the Straits of Gibraltar he got to, the smaller the larvae were, so he knew they were coming from the Atlantic. That's why he spent all his time in the Atlantic. And he was interrupted by minor things like the First World War, but continued to try and locate the source of all the eels, which he then found. All the eels from the east coast of North America and Europe all come from the same place, as you probably know. You know? Well, the Sargasso Sea, so he discovered. And the life cycle of the eel is that they spend about 10 years in the rivers of Europe or the east coast of North America, and then they head back to the Sargasso Sea. They get up to some dirty business in there, and then these larvae float on the ocean currents, sometimes as much as 2 or 3 years. They change sex 2 or 3 times, and then one day decide, no, they're female. And then they find their way back and go through the cycle again. And so the hero of our story is Johannes Schmidt. We associate with the transcendent qualities of ingenuity and persistence, that is what science is all about. We have a narrative that frames the knowledge, and all the knowledge we want to teach about eels can be put into the context of our little unit. So, and it works very well. If you want to try it, I guarantee. Thank you. So there's our conclusion here. So what we've been trying to do is find ways in which we can make it easier for teachers to see the content they're trying to teach in context, of narrative structures that draw on these human, emotional, humorous qualities that make not just life worth living, but also can make the classroom a place of serious pleasure for our students. I think that's all I've got to say. We could have comments and questions or abuse, money.